Chapter 12. I headed out at the same time as Mr. Glass, accepting a ride in his carriage to the Masons' St. Martin's Lane shop and house. Mr. Glass paid me little attention. His nose was glued to the windows, watching for signs of someone following us, I suspected. If he spotted anyone, he didn't say so to me or Duke, who rode with us. Willie hadn't risen by the time we departed, so he'd left her home. "Enjoy your day, Miss Steele," Cyclops called down as I alighted from the carriage. I clamped a hand to my hat to stop it falling off as I peered up at him. "You too, Cyclops." Mr. Glass tugged on his hat brim. "I'll see you for dinner." The coach rumbled away. It hadn't even reached the corner when Catherine burst out of the house like an excited puppy. She threw her arms around me, almost knocking me over. "India, it's so good to see you." She clasped my hand and dragged me toward the door. "I've been dying to tell you something." "What?" She closed the door and took both my hands in hers. Her grin split her flushed face. "You'll never believe it, but John Wilcox has come calling." "Who?" "John Wilcox, the manager from the steelworks factory." "Oh, I remember him now." I'd run occasional errands to the steelworks factory when I'd needed supplies over and above our regular delivery. "Do you mean to say he's calling here with a view to courting you?" "Yes! Isn't it thrilling?" Clearly she thought it thrilling, since she couldn't stand still. Her fingers kneaded mine, and she bounced on her toes. I wasn't as thrilled as her. John Wilcox was in his 30s and rather dour in nature. I couldn't imagine him keeping up with such an energetic person as Catherine. I hoped he didn't stifle her. Of course, it may not get to that stage. Surely she'd tire of him first. "India?" Mrs. Mason emerged from the kitchen, wringing her hands in her apron. "I didn't know you were stopping by today." "My visit wasn't planned," I said, smiling. "Well, you're welcome, of course. I've just baked fresh butter biscuits." She returned to the kitchen, leaving me staring at her back. She'd never been an enthusiastic person like Catherine, but she'd always been welcoming. While she wasn't rude this time, she wasn't keen to see me either. Something had changed. Perhaps her husband had finally confided in her about whatever it was that troubled him, whatever was troubling all the watchmakers. "He's quite distinguished, don't you think?" Catherine said, once again taking my hand and pulling me after her. We didn't head to the kitchen, however, but to the sitting room. "Yes," I said. "I suppose he does look distinguished." If a little thick in the middle and around the jaw, and in the head. "And he says I'm the most agreeable young woman he's ever met." He smiled as he said it, most flirtatious. "Agreeable? That's what he gave as his main reason for courting you." "I know, it's quite a compliment, isn't it? And we're not courting yet, India, steady on. He's only said that he'll call on me." "Catherine, do promise you'll be careful. Don't jump at the first proposal you get, unlike me. I'm sure there'll be others." "Don't be silly. Why do I need to be careful? India, he's a manager. They earn much more than ordinary shopkeepers, so Gareth said." "I do hope that's not your primary consideration for encouraging him," I said. "Your brother doesn't know the particulars of Mr. Wilcox's situation. Besides, some shopkeepers do very well." Catherine flounced into a chair by the unlit fireplace. "Why won't you be pleased for me?" I crouched in front of her and took her hand in mine. "Catherine, you are a lively, friendly, beautiful girl, and I'm sure Mr. Wilcox is the first beau of many for you. I just don't want you to rush into anything like I did." "Mr. Wilcox isn't like Eddie, India. He's honest and solid. He's a good man." "And Eddie is the dried turd on a sheep's behind." She snickered. "Yes, but don't let Mamma hear you say it." I grinned and stood. "Speaking of your mother," I whispered, "she seems upset with me. Both your parents do. Have I done something wrong?" "I'm not sure," she whispered back, glancing at the door. She did mention that she's disappointed in your choice to live with Mr. Glass. I'm his lodger. She thinks you've lost your moral compass since your father died. She frowned. Or that it's no longer pointing north, something like that. She waved her hand. I overheard Papa tell her that he's worried about your influence on me. As had I. The Masons had never been worried before Father died. Why had everything suddenly changed? It was disconcerting, to say the least. The Masons were good people and my friends. Without them, I didn't want to think about the loneliness the loss of their friendship would bring. Do your parents think I'm going to corrupt you? I don't know. Would you like to come and live in Mr. Glass's harem with me? I teased, trying to make light when all I felt was heavy. She giggled again. You're so wicked, India. If only everyone knew you like I did, you'd have a dozen beaux knocking on your door. You ought to allow men to see you as you are and not be so stern with them. I blinked down at her, the wind well and truly knocked out of my sails. Stern? Is that how others see me? She bit her lip and lifted one shoulder. If my brothers can be taken as a good representation of the masculine gender, yes. Sorry, she squeaked. I've upset you. No, I laughed as I sat on the chair. Not at all. Don't take offence on your brother's accounts, but they don't appeal to me either. Perhaps my sternness is a way of keeping men like them at a distance. I laughed again, but her words struck a chord. It wasn't the first time she called me prickly, nor was she the only person to have done so. Perhaps there was some truth to it. Perhaps I only had myself to blame for being a spinster. If they thought me prickly, what would they think of Willie? I was a sweet angel compared to her. That thought lifted my mood somewhat. Mrs. Mason entered carrying a tray with teapot, cups and warm butter biscuits. I thought you would have been too busy to make calls, she said, setting the tray down. Not too busy to see old friends, I said. Good friends. She smoothed down her apron, her lips flattening. Yes, well, I'll pour, I said. Please sit down, Mrs. Mason. Have tea with us. Very well. Has Catherine told you about Mr. Wilcox? I nodded. I'm pleased for her. India has cautioned me about rushing into anything, Catherine said, as you have, Mamma. You always were a cautious, considerate girl, India. A steadying influence on our Catherine, that's what you were. Were? I tried to catch her attention, but she wasn't looking at me. She didn't meet my gaze as we sipped our tea and ate biscuits like three ladies without a care in the world. But the tense undercurrent wasn't lost on me, or on Catherine, I suspected. She became extra bubbly, filling in the conversational gaps with gossip she'd heard from other families in the watch and clock business. I let her continue in the hope she'd mentioned something about why I was no longer welcomed by people I'd known for years. Finally, my patience was rewarded when she mentioned Mr. Lawson, the watchmaker I'd forced to tell us about Mirth. Catherine's pretty face crumpled into a frown when she spoke about his new apprentice. What is it? I asked. Is there something the matter with the apprentice? It's not him. She glanced at her mother. It's nothing. It can't be nothing, I said, wishing I hadn't invited Mrs. Mason to join us for tea. Is something wrong with Mr. Lawson? Is he ill? Oh, India, he's being beastly about you. Catherine never was very good at keeping secrets from me. Catherine, her mother said stiffly, you shouldn't tattle. But India ought to know what people are saying about her. You said so to Papa yourself. Mrs. Mason's face coloured. You shouldn't listen at doors. I wasn't, Catherine muttered. I heard you through the wall. What are people saying about me? Go on, I said when she hesitated. I can take a little criticism on the chin. She drew in a deep breath and let it out slowly. Mr. Lawson is saying that you've become wicked since your father passed." "Wicked? Because I'm living in Mr. Glass's house?" Mrs. Mason sipped her tea loudly. It would seem she wasn't going to disagree with me, perhaps because she wasn't prepared to offer me a bed here. Catherine winced. "I suppose so. Eddie has chosen not to defend your honour too. Can you believe it? What a horrid man he turned out to be, and yet he was so nice in the beginning. So, you're Mr. Glass. Is he as lovely as he seems?" "He's quite well-mannered," except when he was stroking the underside of my bare breast after opening my corset, and when he was flirting with me for reasons I couldn't fathom. "He's been kind to me, his aunt too, and his cousin Wilhelmina." It was worth reminding them about the females living in Mr. Glass's household. I may not have been able to stop the gossip, but I could reassure my friends. Neither Eddie's nor Mr. Lawson's opinions mattered to me now. Did Mr. Lawson tell you that I called on him recently as part of our search for Mr. Glass's mysterious watchmaker? "No, but perhaps he told Papa. They were alone for some time last night, in the workshop." Catherine's gaze slid to her mother's. She bit her lip, then sipped her tea. I forged on. Apparently Mr. Lawson knew the whereabouts of a Mr. Mirth, a watchmaker who closed his shop some years ago and travelled overseas. "Do you know Mirth, Mrs. Mason?" She frowned into her teacup. "The name does ring some bells, but I can't picture him. He couldn't have been one of our close circle, or I would know." I believed her. She wasn't a liar. "Hopefully he'll turn up," I said. "Mr. Glass is quite keen to find him." "Your Mr. Glass is a very determined man," Catherine said with a sly smile. "What will he do if he can't find Mirth?" "Continue to question the other London watchmakers, I suppose, although he has to speak to them on his own while I remain in the carriage." Although I looked at Catherine, I watched her mother out of the corner of my eye. She held herself quite still. Many of them seem wary of me. "Wary?" Catherine repeated. "How so?" "Almost as if they're afraid of me. It's quite odd." "Why would they be afraid of you? Do you think it's because Mr. Abercrombie has accused you of stealing?" "I don't think so. Mr. Abercrombie's accusations seem to be a product of his wariness, not the other way round. Speaking of which, have he or the police come here asking after me?" "No," Catherine said. "I do hope that means he retracted the accusation. Horrid man, I never liked him." "He has retracted it," Mrs. Mason said. "So your father told me last night." "He has?" I felt faint with relief. Thank goodness. So Mr. Glass had taken care of it like he'd promised. It only remained to be discovered how he'd managed to get Abercrombie to do an about-face. "Do you know why he changed his mind, Mrs. Mason?" "No." Her coolness toward me was beginning to grate on my nerves as well as worry me. I decided to confront her on it. "I do hope you don't believe the rumours Mr. Lawson, Eddie and the others are spreading about Mr. Glass and me. I can assure you our arrangement is decent and proper." I just thought of something that might get her to think differently. "He's the nephew of Lord Rycroft." "He's a lord!" Catherine half rose out of her seat in excitement. "No, just a Mr. His uncle is the current Baron." Both Mrs. Mason and Catherine pressed their hands to their chests as if trying to still rapid heartbeats. "He's a gentleman of quality, then," Mrs. Mason said, her face lifting. "How kind that he's taken you in, India." My smile tightened. "Very kind. Don't allow your head to be turned, though," she warned. "Nobility is all well and good, but he's a man underneath it all. Mark my words, India. High-born men are not very different from low-born men when it comes to it." "Mamma, you're frightening her." I laughed. "Not at all. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Mason, but I'm in no danger from Mr. Glass." It was time to change the subject. Being lectured wasn't something I was used to or liked. Father had never been one to do so after my mother died. Mr. Glass had other errands to run today, but we hope to resume our search for Mirth and the Watchmaker tomorrow and discover if they're one and the same. On a Sunday? Mrs. Mason said. The shops will be closed, and I don't recommend you visit anyone at home. Why not? Most watchmakers lived above their shops or nearby. I knew where to find many of their homes. I don't think it's a good idea. Mr. Glass leaves on Tuesday, so we need to use all the time left to us. Tuesday? Good. Why? Both Catherine and I asked. Mrs. Mason shrugged and glanced at the door. She looked like she wanted to escape, but didn't want to leave either. Perhaps she didn't want to leave me alone with Catherine. She was afraid of me too. The notion opened a well inside me that filled with an ache. Mrs. Mason, I ventured. Why have you changed toward me? What have I done to deserve this coolness I'm confronted with at every turn? I managed to keep the wobble out of my voice until the end. Nothing, Catherine said brightly. No one is cool toward you, are they, Mamma? But Mrs. Mason didn't answer. She set down her cup and buried her hands in her apron. Mamma? Catherine shifted forward on her seat and glanced nervously at me. Mrs. Mason, I prompted. Please. I don't know anything, she said, sounding wretched. She was an honest, good woman with a kind heart. So what was stopping her from being open with me? Mr. Mason was urged not to help you find the watchmaker, that's all. Not that he can. He doesn't know of anyone fitting the fellow's description, and nor do I. But you were warned nevertheless, I said, sitting back heavily. By whom? Catherine gasped. That's why Papa has received so many callers of late. Several guild members have visited him in the last 2 days, she told me. We never usually see them, as Papa isn't particularly friendly with them, so it's been quite noticeable. Some of the more senior members have paid calls, Mrs. Mason clarified. Led by Abercrombie, I muttered. He hasn't been here himself, she said. But he was most likely behind the visits. Why does he dislike me so much? Catherine set her cup down and crouched before me. Her sweet face was full of earnestness. I've never liked him. He's an upstart and a toad, and he thinks women are beneath him. He's afraid of your skill as a watchmaker, that's my theory. Afraid of seeing a woman surpass him. She looked to her mother. Do you agree, Mamma? I do, she said with an emphatic nod and a sigh of relief. Why would she be relieved by such an explanation? Unless it wasn't the entire explanation, yet it meant not having to give me the other, more troubling one. Part of me wanted to push her to tell me, but I suppressed the urge. I didn't want to place her in an awkward position. My presence here is making things difficult for you, I said, rising. I'll leave. No, please stay longer, Catherine urged. Her mother, however, rose too. It was lovely seeing you again, India. Do take care. She set about gathering the dishes, ignoring her daughter's narrow-eyed glare. I took Catherine's hand and led her to the front door. You've been very kind, Catherine, but I won't visit you for some time. I don't want to trouble your parents any more than I have. Don't mind, Mamma. She lowered her voice. Mr. Abercrombie and the guild frighten her. She's not strong like you or me. And your father, do they frighten him too? He must do as they say or risk censure. Yes, of course, you're right. It was selfish of me not to think about the predicament the Masons were in. Whatever reason they had for being wary of me, explaining might get them into further trouble with the guild. Trouble they could ill afford with an organisation that held such power over their livelihood. I needed to find another way to find the answers. I had an idea. I wish I could give Mr. Abercrombie and the other court members a piece of my mind. Do you know when they next meet? Her eyes bulged. You're not considering going, are you? Why not? Because it's madness. They'll all be against you, and it would be awful." "On the contrary, I might finally get some answers. Besides, what can they do to me now? They kept me from becoming a member, warned their members not to employ me, and almost had me arrested for a crime I didn't commit. They've used their power to rob me of my home and my livelihood. As I see it, I have nothing more to lose. They cannot possibly take anything else from me, as I have nothing to take." Her lower lip wobbled, and she threw herself into my arms. "Oh, India, you are the bravest soul." Her voice shook, and I felt a wet tear fall onto my neck. "I wish I could do more to help you, but I feel so useless." I hugged her and patted her back. "You're doing more than enough by simply remaining my true friend. Besides, you can help me. You can tell me when the guild next meets." She pulled away and wiped her cheeks with her thumb. For a long moment I thought she wouldn't answer me. Then she said, "I overheard Papa tell Mama it's tonight at 7 o'clock. I spent the afternoon looking for employment and suitable accommodation, but my mind was on the task I'd set for myself that night. I would confront the guild members about their changed attitude toward me and see if the reason behind it was merely their resentment of my gender or something more. I would also ask them about Mr. Mirth. That way Mr. Glass could come along. While I didn't think they'd use force to throw me out, it would nevertheless give me more confidence to have him at my side. My distracted mind was probably the reason I was unsuccessful in securing new employment. I did, however, find clean and comfortable rooms to let on the second floor of a modest Bloomsbury house. The landlady was a widow of the late curator of the British Museum's medieval collection and seemed relieved to have a female applicant. I promised to deliver references before Tuesday. I didn't tell her that my employer would leave London that day, and I had nothing further lined up. It was a mere 40-minute walk back to Park Street, but a sudden burst of rain forced me to make an unscheduled stop beneath the butcher's awning at the circus end of Oxford Street. I waited with several shoppers who'd also been caught without umbrellas, much to the butcher's annoyance. He huffed and puffed in the doorway, but fortunately didn't force anyone to move on. "Miss Steele?" The voice behind me was familiar, yet I couldn't quite place it. I turned and drew in a sharp breath. "Mr. Dorchester, what a coincidence!" The fellow from the gambling house looked fairer in daylight, his eyes bluer. They turned his rather ordinary face into something remarkable. I couldn't look away. He smiled and doffed his hat. "Certainly is. I see you've been caught without an umbrella." "I have, and the rain looks set for the day." "Then allow me." He handed me his folded umbrella. "No, I couldn't possibly take it." "Then may I walk you home and we can share it? It's large enough." It wasn't far to Park Street. Besides, Mr. Dorchester was an amiable fellow, and having some company might take my mind off the guild meeting. "Thank you, I accept, as long as Park Street isn't out of your way." "Not at all, I was on my way home anyway." "Is that nearby?" "This side of Piccadilly Street, so not far." We stepped out of the milling crowd, and he put up his umbrella. Our arms touched as we walked, so that neither of us got too wet. "I must say I'm glad to see you," he said as we passed shoppers hurrying to get out of the rain. "I was worried about you." "Oh, thank you, but we were fine." "Thanks largely to my aim." "Nevertheless, I didn't like leaving you there, but Mr. Unger assured me you wouldn't come to harm. If he hadn't promised, I would have insisted on staying." I didn't tell him that Mr. Unger and the other gamblers hadn't been any assistance at all when we'd been attacked. The incident was in the past, and I saw no reason to let Mr. Dorchester feel terrible for leaving us there. "Did your friend win after I left?" "She lost quite badly." "That's a shame. Doesn't look like a game for the faint of heart, all that bluffing. I'm not sure I have the right countenance for it." "And what countenance do you think is required for a good poker player?" "The ability to lie with a straight face." I laughed. I quite agree. It's not a game for me. My father used to tell me that my thoughts were written all over my face. Your father is a wise fellow. I didn't tell him my father should be mentioned in the past tense. I was still very aware that Mr. Dorchester was a man, and I a single woman alone. Allowing him to think there was no man to care for me might give him ideas similar to those the horrible lords in the gambling house had. Although I couldn't imagine Mr. Dorchester being like them, it never hurt to be cautious. We manoeuvred around a large puddle as we crossed New Bond Street, then fell into step once again. Our pace and stride matched, but I couldn't tell if that was a deliberate effort on his part. Tell me about your factory, Mr. Dorchester. He frowned. You cannot possibly be interested in that. I'm sure it's very interesting. Thank you, but I won't bore you with the details. Tell me about yourself. I provided him with the briefest summary, once again avoiding mentioning my father's death. I'm staying with Willie and her friends, newly arrived from America, I told him, but only until they leave on Tuesday. How does a watchmaker's daughter make friends from so far afield? We met through an acquaintance. Eddie could be considered an acquaintance of both Mr. Glass's and mine, so it wasn't a lie. We talked the entire way back to Park Street, mostly about the sights he'd seen since arriving in London a few days before. He'd combined a sightseeing journey with a visit to his lawyer's office, but was only in the city for a few more days. I told him which coffee shops had the best coffee and where he could find the best silks as gifts for his mother and sister back home. That steered us onto the subject of his family. Unlike me, who was quite keen to talk about them, his eyes lit up even more as he did so. By the time we reached Park Street, I was regretting parting company with him. This is me, I said, stopping at the steps of number 16. I smiled up at him. Thank you for walking with me. It was very kind of you to offer me refuge beneath your umbrella. He chuckled softly. The pleasure was all mine. He glanced past me to the door. I'm glad you emerged safely from that ruckus last night, Miss Steele. I was terribly worried about you after I left, asking myself if I'd done the right thing in leaving you there. Something he said sparked a memory, but I couldn't place what it was. Perhaps it was merely the horrid memory of the night before. May I be so bold as to ask you something? He said. Of course. My heart skipped, but I wasn't sure why. If Mr. Dorchester asked to see me again, I wasn't sure what I'd do. Did I want to see him? Did I want to get to know him further? I suppose it couldn't hurt. Will you be at church tomorrow? He said. Yes, of course. Why? Because I'd like to know which one to attend in order to see you again. I laughed and bowed my head to hide my blush. I believe Grosvenor Chapel is the nearest. Then I hope to see you in the morning. He walked me up the steps and deposited me at the door. I'm glad I bumped into you, Miss Steele. So am I said. I'd be thoroughly wet otherwise. He laughed, but I winced on the inside. I'd made it sound like I'd used him for his umbrella. I had enjoyed our walk together, but not in that way, I realised. Not in the same way I enjoyed Mr. Glass's company. It was like comparing chocolate and apples. Both tasted good, yet one was a decadent experience to be savoured, and the other something that could be found in every grocer's cart on every corner. I liked both, but I would always choose chocolate over an apple. I hope I haven't caused you any trouble, he said. Not at all. It's just that you have an observer. He nodded at the window. The curtain fluttered, but not before I saw Miss Glass's face disappear from sight. I smiled. Goodbye, Mr. Dorchester, and thank you again. I slipped inside and shut the door. I barely removed one arm from my coat when Miss Glass emerged from the entrance to the sitting room. Who was that, dear? She asked. An acquaintance by the name of Dorchester. I don't know any Dorchesters. He's from Manchester. Manchester? She wrinkled her nose. What's he doing in London? Visiting. From Manchester, she said, incredulous. It's hardly the other side of the world. It might as well be. Those accents. She shuddered. It's like listening to glass break. His accent is quite refined. I didn't detect a hint of Mancunian. She sniffed, and I thought that the end of it, but she followed me all the way to the kitchen. I fetched bread, cheese and plum jam from the pantry and set them out on the table. Have you eaten? I asked. Pickett fixed me something earlier. She sat at the stool and watched me spread jam on a slice of bread. He's not particularly handsome. Are we still discussing Mr. Dorchester? He's rather short, too, and he had a way of walking that I didn't like. I pressed my lips together to suppress my smile. Perhaps they walk differently in Manchester. I suppose he is in trade. He has a factory. She clicked her tongue and picked at the cheese. I sliced off the wedge, but didn't eat it. You can do better than an ugly factory worker from Manchester. You forgot his odd walking style. This is not a joke, India. I set down the knife with a sigh. I appreciate your concern, but there's no need. I'm not considering Mr. Dorchester as a suitor. You may not be, but he might be considering you. Sometimes men, I won't refer to him as a gentleman since I don't know his connections, can be difficult to remove once they latch onto you. I've seen very eligible girls swept up by a romantic gesture from a man who is not at all suitable. I was about to protest that I wasn't susceptible to romantic gestures, but past experience showed that to be false. While Eddie hadn't shouted his love for me from a rooftop, he'd given me flowers and trinkets on a regular basis and been attentive from the start. I stuffed my mouth full of bread and jam to avoid answering and hoped Miss Glass would leave the topic of Mr. Dorchester alone. Unfortunately, she was only getting started and proceeded to warn me about the dangers of a woman alone in the world and men of unknown connections. The only way I could see to stop her was to tell her that I'd learned my lesson from Eddie. Thankfully, Willie walked in, distracting Miss Glass. I'd never been so pleased to see her, even though she wore an ominously thunderous expression. Bread? I offered. Cheese? God, yes. Willie descended on the table like a hawk on a field mouse. I'm half-starved. I handed her a slice of bread with jam and hoped it would be enough to chase her black mood away. She bit into it, tearing off a chunk with her teeth like a lion ripping apart a poor creature it had just caught. Don't see you down here much, she said to Miss Glass around her mouthful. Miss Glass looked horrified, which I suspected was Willie's intention. That Barley girl not feeding you? Pickett takes good care of me, thank you. Why'd you call her by her last name? It's the way things are done here. I don't expect anyone from an American backwater to understand. Miss Glass wanted to talk to me about Mr. Dorchester, I said quickly, before Willie's temper had a chance to flare. He escorted me home just now. Who? The man from the poker game last night. The one who punched Lord Denison. Punched? Miss Glass's hand fluttered at her black lace collar. I knew he was no good. He defended me, I said. Tosh, he's a Dorchester from Manchester. It even sounds ridiculous. Willie snorted. That it does. I couldn't help smiling, even though I wanted to defend him. That's not the point. He was kind to me and I like him, but not in that way, I assured Miss Glass. Nor will I be seduced by romantic gestures, if he performs any. It takes more than trinkets and promises to intrigue me now. Good, Miss Glass said with a satisfied nod. I'm glad to hear it. Your mother will be pleased that I saved you from an unfavourable attachment. My mother? Willie and I exchanged glances. She drew a little circle at her temple and rolled her eyes, then stuffed more bread into her mouth. "Perhaps you should have a rest," I said to Miss Glass. "I do feel a little tired." She wandered out of the kitchen, and I hoped she didn't wander out of the house altogether. When I heard her maid's voice, my concern eased. Polly would care for her. Willie dragged over a stool and slumped onto it. She threw down her uneaten bread, smearing jam on the table. It would seem her mood hadn't been lifted by our discussion. "You're still upset about your locket," I said, sitting too. I reached for her hand, but she snatched it away. "I went to see Travers." Oh dear, I didn't need a crystal ball to see where this was going. "Did he speak to you?" She nodded. "I offered to buy back the locket, but he refused." I doubted she had any money left after the previous night, but I didn't ask where she planned on getting the funds. "He said I could try to win it back," she went on. "You told him no, didn't you?" "I had to. I have nothing more to my name, and Matt, Duke, and Cyclops won't lend me nothing. They hate me playing poker. They warned me this would happen." She placed her forehead in the crook of her arm on the table. "They must be patting themselves on their backs now." That doesn't sound like something they would do. I touched her shoulder, but she shrugged me off. "What if you offer Lord Travers double its worth, then ask Mr. Glass for a loan? I'm sure he'll help if he knows it'll get the locket back for certain." "Travers won't accept it. He wants to play poker, and what the high and mighty Lord wants, the high and mighty Lord gets." She proceeded to call him a vile name that had me blushing. I tried to think of another solution, but came up with nothing. She'd brought this on herself, and I shouldn't feel sorry for her, but I did. Although I couldn't see her face, I knew from her sniffing that she was crying. "Do you think you can beat him?" I asked. "Yes, if I'm dealt good cards and he doesn't cheat again." I sighed. It was hopeless. "You should speak to Mr. Glass. Perhaps he can talk to Lord Travers man to man. It's unfair, but Travers strikes me as a fellow who respects men and not women. Mr. Glass has a way with words and might be able to convince him to sell the locket back to you." She sat up straight and swiped at her eyes and cheeks. "Don't tell him, India. What you're saying makes sense, and if anyone can convince Travers, it's Matt. But he's got so much on his plate right now, he doesn't need the extra burden, nor does he have the time." It was the least selfish display I'd seen from her, and it quite flipped my opinion. "He's quite ill, isn't he?" I asked softly. I hardly breathed as I waited for her answer. It came in the form of a small nod, nothing more. "What does his doctor say?" I pressed. She hopped off the stool. "Matt wouldn't want me discussing it, so don't ask. But his health is not your concern." She grasped my shoulders and shook them. "Your job is to find the watchmaker. Even if Matt's caught up with other matters, you must continue with the search on your own." She shook me again, harder this time. "Promise me that you will." "I will," I said. "I promise." "There's an important guild meeting tonight. Several watchmakers will be there. Attending it will save a lot of time overseeing them individually." She let me go. Relief flooded her face. She even smiled, sort of. It was twitchy and uncertain, but it was an improvement on her scowl. Good. Unfortunately, my plan to take Mr. Glass with me to the meeting didn't come to pass. He hadn't returned home by 7 o'clock. Waiting longer might mean missing the meeting altogether. I would have taken Cyclops or Duke, but they were still out too. Willie would probably have come, but she was a volatile weapon that might go off at the wrong time. I would have to face the guild alone. I wasn't looking forward to it.